As everyone is aware, the dark times that we have been facing all the way back to the very first Imam and to the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi, we see that throughout the ages there has always been tyranny and there has always been oppression and there has always been evil acts committed by the enemies of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the enemies of the religion of Islam. But what we see is that Allah Azza wa Jalla doesn't leave the mu'mineen and doesn't leave the believers in a state where they are alone, in a state whereby they have no one to guide them. Of course, we have our awaited 12th Imam, Imam al-Mahdi Ajjallah Farajah Sharif. But we also have individuals who come as representatives and deputies of this Imam who help guide the people in his absence and help bring them back into the straight path of Islam and teach them about the true teachings of the religion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In our recent history, especially in the history of Iraq for example, we have two very special luminous stars of guidance sent, of course, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to the people to help guide them back onto this correct path. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent these two individuals to go and learn, to become teachers and educators, and they were just like any of us. And indeed any of us have the capability and the capacity to become like these two figures. But there was two purposes that they were sent to fill. One of these purposes was to guide people, of course, back to the correct teachings of Islam as taught by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And the other was to become a revolutionary shield, protectors for the Muslims and for the entire Ummah and the followers of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. And these two luminous stars which I'm talking about are actually cousins of each other from the same family and from the same family tree. The first one was Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and then we have his cousin Grand Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr. These two individuals are people that we probably already know by name. We are probably used to seeing their pictures. In fact, in our family homes in Iraq or even here we may have their pictures hanging on the wall. But it's important that we do not let these two people just become faces on the wall, or we do not let them just become names that are destined to stay in the past with no relevance in today's world. It's important that we give them the credit they are due because of the legacy which they have left behind for us and for what they have taught us. It is important that we teach our children the relevance of these individuals, and that we teach our children the same things which those individuals taught us and taught our fathers. Because these men were not just scholars, they were not just even maraja, they were more than that. They were architects, they helped build systems, they were revolutionaries, meaning they helped to bring down evil governments, and of course they were living embodiments of the message of Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Something which is very rare to find nowadays, people who not just in their belief but also in their actions carry out this message. And what their legacy helped show and provide for us was an entire roadmap and a framework. There was a plan which was concocted by the first Shaheed al-Sadr and which was then implemented by Shaheed al-Thani, Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, which helped lay out a plan for the Ummah in terms of politics, in terms of resistance, in terms of economics and helping countries thrive economically to ensure that everybody has enough money and that this money is distributed in a fair and just way. And also social governance, meaning how people interact with each other in day-to-day life, how rulers interact with the people who live underneath them as well. These two martyrs had a plan and had a map which was fully established, and they sought to implement this project into the real world so that the Muslims would be able to benefit. They helped, for example, explain how a society and how the people should rise up in the face of a Taghuti government in the same way as Abu Abdullah alayhi salam did. They also helped set out the necessity of a just economic system so that a government takes care of its people through financial means, the same type of way in which Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam did. And so today, inshallah, if we try and understand Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr and Shaheed Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr as two halves of one beautiful project which is completed by each other, then we will understand a little bit more about them and what we need to do to honour their legacy. The first person we'll talk about is, of course, Shaheed Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. May Allah have mercy on his soul. And when we talk about Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, the first thing which springs to our mind and the first thing which becomes apparent is the level of intellectual genius which this man had, the level of knowledge which this man had. Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr became mujtahid, some people say, at the age of 15 years old. Nowadays, when we see our 15-year-olds, many of them don't have an interest in religion, or if they do, it's just basic. Instead, Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, from a young age, put lots of emphasis on his pursuit of knowledge and becoming as intelligent as possible. Why? Because he recognized that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave human beings the aql, gave them the intellect, so that they would go out and learn. For about 17 or 18 years, when Shaheed al-Sadr was studying his religious studies in the Hawza, his days, of course, were 24 hours long, the same as our days. And what his students and what his teachers alike both said was that out of this 24-hour period, 16 whole hours were dedicated to studying and learning about the religion of Islam. For 16 hours of the day, his head was in the books, studying to gain as much information as possible. Why? To benefit himself? No. The reason why he spent so much time studying was because he recognized that the system he was living in at the time was an un-Islamic system, was run by the Taghut, was run by the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And so he thought that the best way in which he could combat these people was to gain as much knowledge as possible, and so that he could create a plan and a framework to help change this entire system and flip it on its head to create an Islamic government, an Islamic system. His legacy can be summarized in three main projects which he achieved. The first one was his rebuilding of the Islamic thought and ideology. At the time, as you are aware, in Iraq and in Iran and across the entire Western Asia, whether it be Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, we see that there was two main ideologies which were competing to become the most prominent. Three, actually. First was communism from the Soviet Union and Russia. Secondly was capitalism from America and Britannia. And third was nationalism, which actually is found all across the world. But at the time there was what was known as Arab nationalism. People who wanted to pride themselves on having an Arab identity and basing their entire governance and culture and social system around this. Shaheed al-Sadr recognized that all three of these ideologies and beliefs were wrong. And in fact, he deemed that they were actually paths which led someone to kufr, because they were in rejection of the Islamic ideology. And so he set out an argument. He said, we don't need any of these things. We have Islam. Islam is self-sufficient. Islam does not need a Western or an Eastern ideology to come and to help make it perfect in terms of the economy or in terms of politics. No. He says that the Holy Quran and Rasulullah and the Ahlul Bayt have provided us with more than enough in order to govern ourselves according to their beliefs and to their ideology. So he writes a book. One of the books he writes is called Iqtisaduna, which in English means our economics. And this book, many people in the West, when they hear about it, or even some of us Shia, when we hear about the book Iqtisaduna, we think it's just a book on economics, meaning it's boring and majority of people don't need to read it because they won't understand it. But this is not right. It's not just a book. It's actually a masterpiece. It is a book which, if you give to any Western philosopher or economist, they will struggle to replicate something like it, and they will struggle to even understand how such a system works due to the level of genius which he has. In this book, Shaheed al-Sadr dismantles both the ideology of communism and the ideology of capitalism. He talks about the contradictions which it has, and he talks about the deficiencies which each of these systems has, and what is wrong with both of them. But he doesn't just write this book to attack these ideologies and give us nothing in return. Instead, he does something which is the trait of a very intellectual person. He provides his own solution to these two problems which are being faced. He says that capitalism is wrong and communism is wrong. But the perfect solution to both of these ideologies or any other ideology is one word: Islam. Islam has the solution. Islam has the answer for all of the queries and all of the questions which these two ideologies want to address. Therefore, he didn't just critique it and criticize them for the sake of doing so. He built a solution for us to try and implement in order to create the perfect society to live in. For example, he talks about the concept of Islamic banking in terms of prohibiting loans and interest on them and the usury, all of these things which unfortunately we are faced with today. He talks about the rights that people have for their property and for their land and for everything they own. And he also talks about social justice, meaning everybody is treated fairly in a society by the people at the top. And through doing all of these things, he proves to anyone who reads the book that Islam has the answer for everything, and that this answer is always perfect in nature. But he doesn't just write this book. He writes another book called Falsafatuna, which is our philosophy. Again, one of the most detailed, comprehensive works from Islamic thought, which talks not just about philosophy itself. He goes into the book and he argues against Western and Eastern philosophy. He defends the foundations of knowledge which is given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, divine knowledge, against materialist and skeptical philosophies and differing philosophies. And what he does is he establishes the Islamic thought based on intellectual and rational grounds, meaning everything he writes in that book, a rational person and a person with intellect will have no choice but to come to the exact same conclusions. Therefore, he is a genius in this sense. But he also sets out a political thought as well, and this is where it becomes really important that we understand the legacy of Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr. He did not believe in an Islam or a version of Islam that was quiet and not involved in politics. No. He was a firm believer in the ideology of Wilayat al-Faqih, something which, by the way, is not just a matter which you can choose whether or not you agree with or not. All the Shia agree on Wilayat al-Faqih. The differentiation and the differences is to the extent of it. However, he believed it was entirely necessary. And we see this through the way he was so devoted to figures like Imam al-Tamimi, and the way in which he supported him through all of his struggles and his endeavours. In fact, one of the beautiful statements from Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr is that he says, "Being a poor shopkeeper and having little to no money into my name is more beloved to me than having the status and the position of marja'iyah under the system of someone like Saddam." This shows how much and how strongly he believed in this theory of Wilayat al-Faqih, how much he was willing to sacrifice in order to live under a governance style like it. And he also talked about An-Na'ib al-Am, which is the righteous deputy of Imam al-Mahdi, in his occultation and in his absence. Which means that when the Imam is in the period of occultation and we do not have direct access to the Imam, there must be a righteous deputy, someone who represents him on his behalf, and this person has to be one of the fuqaha, and he must be just, and he must be righteous, and he must be knowledgeable. And whilst the Imam is in occultation, this person is in charge of leading and representing him, not just politically, not just socially, but also legally as well. Meaning all areas are encompassed under this guardianship of the faqih. Some of the other things which he established in terms of political thought was the Hizb al-Da'wah party, which of course is different from that which exists today, unfortunately. And at the time, this party was very impressive, and its actions and movements were very successful against the Ba'ath regime. However, because he was so involved in the political struggle against the government of Kufr, the government of Saddam, and because of his anti-imperialist statements, and because of his rejection of that system, unfortunately, this resulted in his martyrdom by the evil tyrant of the time. It wasn't just a normal death that he faced. Shaheed al-Sadr was tortured before he was killed in the most brutal way, along with his sister Bint al-Huda, who herself was a scholar, a teacher, an educator, an activist, and a role model for our women. And one of the stories we have during the interrogation of Shaheed al-Sadr by the head of the secret police in Iraq at the time, he made a demand and he tortured Shaheed al-Sadr. And he said, we will let you go and we will give you freedom and your sister will be released and you can live a happy life on the condition that you denounce what is happening in Iran and you denounce the system of Wilayat al-Faqih. Shaheed al-Sadr refuses. He says, the only thing that I sought to do in my life and the only thing which I have dreamed of since a young age was to make the establishment of an Islamic government possible. And since this has been achieved in Iran under the leadership of Imam al-Khomeini, then everything which I have sought to do in my entire life, all of the efforts which I have made, and all the dreams which I had have come true. And so if you want to kill me, you can kill me, and I will thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for it. This is the level of thought which this person has. And if he is going this far, and he is ready to make this sacrifice, then he, as a Shia, as a Muslim, as a Marja, is a real inspiration to all of us today. When he was buried, his grave was made secret. Many people did not know where he was buried. In fact, the only people who knew where the grave of Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr was a couple of the police who were involved in the burial, and the person who dug the grave himself, which was a man by the name of Abbas Badash. During the war between Saddam and Iran, Abbas is still doing his job as a gravedigger, and one of the students of Shaheed al-Sadr by the name of Kamil went to Wadi al-Salam to try and seek safety from the war. Whilst he is there, he becomes curious and he wants to know where the body of Shaheed al-Sadr is buried. And so he reaches out to a couple of people and eventually he finds Abbas Badash, the guy who dug the grave. He tells him where the grave is, and he goes to the ulama and he asks them for permission. Can we go and move the grave somewhere so that we can give Shaheed al-Sadr a more dignified burial place and resting place? And the ulama said, yes, we can move him. When they take up the body from the ground, they realize that although many years had gone past since the martyrdom of Shaheed al-Sadr, his body was still fresh. His body was as if he had died yesterday. Although what they noticed was that on the body there was severe marks of torture. What they found on the body was that there was a bullet wound in the middle of his head. They found that on the back of his neck it had been cut many times by a knife. They saw that his beard had been burnt by fire and they had put a lighter to burn his beard and cause him pain. And they also found 3 stab wounds from a knife on the back of the Sayyid. So they bury him again, and this time only a few people, including the family members, know where he is buried. But again, Saddam's men find where the grave is and they are going to go and destroy it and desecrate it in the manner which they were accustomed to doing. So again, they take the body up, and what they find is that the body is still fresh after this time. Then, after the time of Saddam, the body is taken up yet again and is put in its final resting place as a mausoleum. Now, the reason why I mentioned this story, why the body was taken up 3-4 times, why there was such an effort to go and find the body, is due to the fact that even when Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr is dead, even when he is no longer alive in this world, this government still saw him as a threat to their entire system. And they realized that even in his death, he is still as influential and still as powerful as when he is alive. And so we've talked about Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, and there's too much to say about him and I don't have enough time. So we'll go on to the other luminous star which we have been blessed with from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr is the architect and the person behind the theory for all of this beautiful works and this beautiful thought, then his cousins, Shaheed Sayyid Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, was the person who was in charge of implementing all of these beautiful thoughts into practice and into the real world. His mission was to put this idea among the masses, amongst the people of Iraq and the wider region, and help them understand the true religion of Rasulullah. In the 1990s, the Shi'as and their community was being strangled by not just the government but also by the sanctions which were placed on them by America and by the United Nations as well. The Hawza in Najaf was under severe surveillance and it was constantly under observation by the dictatorship, and they were restricted in what they could do in terms of spreading the true message of Islam. Shaheed Al-Sadr Thani introduced a very bold and very brave strategy when dealing with this issue of propagating the religion outwardly to people. First things first, he begins holding mass Friday prayers in the city of Kufa and then in other cities as well. This is something which had been suspended by the government for decades before, and it was not common. In the khutbah which he gave in the Jum'ah prayer, he would speak against the government openly. He would criticize them, he would condemn them. He wouldn't hold back and just talk about some of the fada'il, for example. No, he would talk about the relevance of the Ahlul Bayt in today's world and how they would react to a government like the one he was under. He then establishes the popular Hawza, or the revolutionary Hawza, and he brought it directly to the people. And this is something very important. A lot of the time, even nowadays, we see some of the Hawzas, they exist in Najaf or in Qum, wherever they are. And all they do is they teach people and they contain the knowledge and they contain the belief within their seminary. What Shaheed Al-Sadr did was he brought all of the specialized knowledge which was taught to people in the Hawza and he gave it to the people who were among the masses, normal people, everyday people. And he would simplify the messages from the Hawza to them and teach them truly what their religion actually was. Because at the time, they didn't know the true meaning of, for example, Abu Abdullah's sacrifice in Karbala. All they know him as is someone who is martyred. They don't recognize that there is a massive amount of context which is required to understand Sayyid al-Shuhada's martyrdom. The revolution which he did against Yazid, not just for the sake of it, but because Yazid represented Shaitan. And he said, nowadays, we are under a government which is like that of Yazid, meaning a government of Shaitan. Therefore, we need to be of the supporters of Imam Hussein alayhi salam in today's world and rise up against them. And this is one of the most beautiful things he did. And when he gave his lectures, they were not irrelevant. Sometimes the feedback we hear when we ask people, how did you find that Sheikh in Muharram or that Sheikh in Shahr Ramadan? In any country in the world, people say the Sheikh, his lecture was maybe a little bit boring. I didn't really learn much from it. That lecture, I've heard it so many times over and over again. Shaheed Al-Sadr was the opposite of that. He would bring a new topic every single week, something which was engaging for people, something they would like to listen to, something they are interested in hearing. He spoke about Lady Zainab, for example, as the role model for women in today's world. And he talked about Imam al-Mahdi as the hope for liberation in today's world. And he spoke, for example, about how certain governments, for example, America, he says, have entire departments in their government focused on learning about Imam al-Mahdi. And this is something at the time people thought this man is crazy, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's making a conspiracy theory. And then what did we find Joe Biden 2-3 years ago? He talks about the fact that he was introduced to the hidden Imam. And what does Joe Biden says he does? He said, I hired somebody to go and teach me about Imam al-Mahdi. Shaheed Al-Sadr says, they are trying to learn about him so that when he reappears, they will try and be able to control him and to control his followers. So he says, we need to be of the people who truly know about Imam al-Mahdi, so that when he returns, we are actually of his followers. We are the real Ansar al-Mahdi, not the ones who are tricked and deceived by the enemies of the Imam. Again, as his movement grows and it becomes more influential and powerful, his conflict and confrontation with the regime at the time becomes inevitable. In 1999, Shaheed Al-Sadr is travelling with two of his sons, and two gunmen or a few gunmen from the regime come and assassinated him in a tragic way, in a way which had no honour, in a way which was full of cowardice, which was full of guilt, which was full of shame. They shot him and they shot his sons as well. The reason why they shot his sons was because they recognized that his sons were also people who could bring this same force, this same movement, this same thought into Iraq. And of course they left one of them, but the two sons, or the three sons which were martyred, were the true epitome of learning from the great, learning from Shaheed al-Sadr himself. And so they couldn't allow his thought to be carried on into today's world. Again, when he is dead and when he is martyred, he poses an even greater danger and threat to him. And we see this from the way in which the Shia of Iraq mobilized up, using the thought which they were given by the Sayyid, and eventually, shortly after his martyrdom, they were successful in the overthrow of the tyrant and in the overthrow of the government. And so Shaheed al-Sadr al-Thani provided the practical element for what Shaheed Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr set out. He led people to mobilize from the ground. He led normal people to mobilize up against the Yazid of the time. He provided religious leadership in a way which people had access to him. And he set out an example in the modern day of how to be like Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam when faced with a tyrant. And so together they presented a complete model for how Islam should be in the modern day and in the modern age. Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr gave the intellectual justification and the intellectual thought, and Shaheed al-Sadr al-Thani, Muhammad Sadiq al-Sadr, provided the implementation of this beautiful system in the real world so that we could see what it would look like and the beauties of it. Both of them had the idea and the principle that the faqih, or the scholar, is not just somebody who sits on the minbar and does nothing else except give religious lectures. They both say that the faqih has to go out into the world and speak out openly and confront the evil and confront the injustice and not be scared of death. And these were the two most beautiful examples of this being put into practice. And of course, both their lives and their martyrdoms were embodiments of the Holy Quran. The Holy Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and prepare against them whatever you are able to with your power. They gave whatever they were able to. In fact, they both gave their lives, and they gave the lives of their family members in order to confront this evil, the same way as the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam did. This is where I go back to my first statement, which is that these two people seek to bring the message of the Ahlul Bayt into the real world. And so it is upon us, the followers of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, to study their lives and to study their books and their works and their speeches so that we can understand this mentality which they had, and so that we can continue to build up their project and live in the footsteps which they asked us to live in, to make this world worthy of the return of the awaited Imam al-Mahdi Ajjalullah Faraj al-Sharif. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to elevate the status of our martyred scholars and to join us with them in company and in the company of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and may He give us the strength to follow in their footsteps and become the inheritors of their revolutionary ideology today. And for all the shuhada, including the Sadr family and all of the other families which gave shuhada, please recite Surah Al-Fatiha after Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.